The woods had a way of swallowing the light, of twisting familiar sounds into whispers of warning. Deep within, past the gnarled trees and moss-choked paths, a mansion loomed like a wound in the landscape. They said the colonel had come from nowhere, a man whose eyes held storms and whose hands carried the memory of unspeakable bargains. No one in the surrounding towns dared venture near, for the estate was a place where shadows moved of their own accord, and the air smelled of secrets best left unspoken. At night, the wife wandered the halls in tattered gowns, her gaze distant and hollow, as if she were trapped between two worlds. Whispers spread that she had been given, not out of love, but as part of a pact that bound her to 7 men who were never meant to be her equals. The slaves themselves seemed to carry the weight of invisible chains, their lives entwined with a destiny darker than the forest itself. Candles flickered, doors groaned, and in the deepest hours before dawn, the mansion whispered stories of power, obsession, and betrayal, of a dynasty that was never meant to survive. Each rustle in the trees, each shadow in the corner of the eye, carried a warning. Some bargains are forged not in hope, but in terror, and some legacies are destroyed before they are even born. The first time the colonel arrived, the town barely knew what to make of him. He came from nowhere, or at least from nowhere anyone could confirm, a figure shrouded in mystery, riding a black stallion that seemed as restless and untamed as the man himself. His arrival coincided with a heavy fog that clung to the woods and the river, as if the land itself sensed that something unnatural had walked among them. Locals remember seeing him approach the plantation from the winding back roads, the edges of his long coat fluttering like dark wings against the mist. There was an air of authority around him, not the kind earned by years of public service or wealth, but a presence that demanded attention and submission in ways that felt almost predatory. His face was sharp, yet oddly symmetrical, pale in contrast to the dark shadows cast by the trees, and his eyes burned with a quiet intensity that unsettled anyone who dared meet his gaze. Rumors began almost immediately. Some claimed he had inherited the estate under strange circumstances, while others whispered that he had purchased it with money that could only have been gained through sin or blood. The locals, suspicious yet curious, watched as he began to restore the plantation, not to beautify it, but to transform it into something altogether more imposing, more impenetrable, as though the house were meant to be a fortress for secrets rather than a home for life. The men who came to work under him noticed his peculiar routines. He would wander the halls in the dead of night, speaking softly to shadows that moved just out of sight, and he had a strange fascination with the woods surrounding the estate, often disappearing into the trees for hours at a time, returning with traces of dirt and foliage, but never offering explanation. Even the animals seemed wary of him. Dogs refused to follow him indoors, and horses would tremble when he approached the stables, a reaction that locals could not understand and soon attributed to a kind of unnatural authority. The colonel's arrival was more than a physical presence, it was an intrusion into the rhythm of the town, a force that shifted the air and unsettled the senses. Children would peek from behind curtains, catching glimpses of a man whose gaze felt like it could strip the soul bare, and the adults who ventured too close found themselves inexplicably tense, heartbeats quickened, minds filled with unspoken dread. It became evident that he was not just a newcomer to the land, but a man who carried the weight of something older, something dark, something that would ripple through the lives of everyone unfortunate enough to come near the shadow of the estate. The whispers began almost as soon as the colonel settled into the mansion, faint murmurs that wound their way through the town like smoke, curling into every corner and home, carried by those brave, or foolish, enough to speak of the estate. At first, they were dismissed as the usual gossip, the kind that thrives in small towns where a stranger is a curiosity and curiosity is dangerous. But the stories had a consistency that could not be ignored, a pattern that hinted at something far older and far darker than the ordinary rumors of wealth or scandal. They spoke of a pact, though no one dared say exactly what it entailed. Some claimed the colonel had made a bargain that involved his wife, a woman whose beauty had been celebrated even before the family's arrival, whose voice was said to carry a melody that haunted dreams. The townsfolk whispered that she had been given over, not by choice, but as part of a promise bound in secrecy, a promise that tied her fate to men who were not meant to share her name or her bed. Shadows seemed to gather around the stories themselves, lending them a weight that was impossible to ignore. The children who had wandered too close to the estate claimed they heard her crying at night, though the sound carried with it something unnatural, a hollow echo that clung to the trees long after it had vanished. The slaves, too, moved differently after the arrival of the colonel, their eyes darting with unspoken knowledge, their steps careful, as though the earth itself might betray them if they misstepped. Travelers passing near the woods reported strange figures, fleeting shapes that disappeared when approached, yet left the air heavy, suffused with dread. Some swore that if you listened closely enough on certain nights, you could hear the faint sound of chains and low murmurs of negotiation, as though promises and threats had been whispered into the darkness for decades, generations perhaps, each one binding those who came after to a destiny they could neither understand nor escape. The elders, who remembered stories told by their own parents, spoke of a family cursed, a lineage haunted by decisions made in shadow, where loyalty and obedience were intertwined with fear and blood. Even those who had never seen the colonel or his wife felt the presence of the pact pressing upon them, a quiet insistence that the estate was no ordinary home, that its roots reached deeper than the soil, into secrets that could twist lives and crush hope. The whispers were relentless, feeding the imagination, shaping the fears of the town, until it became impossible to separate truth from legend, fact from fear, and everyone knew that whatever lay behind the mansion walls was bound by a promise that could destroy anyone who dared come too close. From the moment the colonel arrived, his wife became the center of an unspoken, oppressive tension that seemed to hang over the estate like a permanent shadow. She moved through the halls with a grace that was almost spectral, yet there was something hollow in her eyes, a distance that unsettled anyone who glimpsed her. Locals said that on certain nights, she would appear at the edge of the woods, standing silently as if listening to voices that no one else could hear, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that the knuckles turned white. The mansion, once a place of life and warmth, became a prison of invisible chains, and she carried the weight of the pact like a constant, unyielding burden. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the strange rituals the colonel forced upon her, of nights spent in locked rooms lit by candlelight where she would emerge trembling, her hair disheveled and her skin pale as if the very act of standing in the presence of the pact drained her of life. It was not only the physical toll that consumed her, there was a psychological torment that clawed at her sanity. Sometimes, she would wander the halls for hours, whispering fragments of sentences, names, and threats that no one else could decipher, her voice barely more than a trembling echo, as though she were trapped between obedience and despair. The slaves themselves seemed to fear her presence almost as much as the colonel's, for in her hollowed eyes they glimpsed the consequences of the unholy agreement, a reminder that the pact extended far beyond the mansion walls. Nights were the worst, when the wind carried the sound of her cries into the town, fragmented and haunting, making dogs bark and children cling to their parents in terror. Those who dared approach the estate claimed that the air around her shimmered with unease, that the shadows twisted in unnatural ways, and that a coldness followed her footsteps, a foreboding that spoke of suffering far greater than ordinary human endurance could explain. Over time, her beauty faded, replaced by a spectral, almost otherworldly appearance, as though each day spent under the shadow of the pact drained her of flesh and warmth. Letters to distant relatives went unanswered, visits were forbidden, and the few who attempted to speak to her found only cryptic, fearful responses, as if even words could be punished. She was both present and absent, a figure caught in the intersection of love, obedience, and terror, her life bound by a promise she had never made and could never break, leaving the entire estate steeped in a tension that none could ignore and that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. It began with a silence that no one could explain, a void where a person had once existed. The first slave to disappear had been quiet, diligent, the type who moved through the mansion and grounds like a shadow, careful to avoid the colonel's scrutiny. One morning, however, the servant simply wasn't there. His bed was untouched, his tools of labor left in place, yet the entire wing of the estate where he had worked carried an unnatural stillness, a tension that made even the other slaves hesitate in their chores. The rumor spread quickly, first among the servants, then to the nearby townsfolk who noticed the absence and the colonel's inexplicable calm. No one saw him leave, no footprints marked the forest floor, and no sound of struggle was ever reported. It was as if he had been consumed by the very air, swallowed by the land that had already begun to feel malevolent. Fear gripped the remaining slaves immediately, each glance over the shoulder carried the weight of suspicion and dread. They whispered of strange lights in the woods at night, of voices that called their names in tones that were both pleading and commanding, and of shadows that moved against the natural flow of the moonlight. Some claimed to have seen the colonel in the darkness, speaking softly in the direction where the missing man had been last seen, his lips moving in words no one else could hear, while the trees around him trembled as if recoiling from his presence. The plantation itself seemed to mourn the loss, the floors creaking more loudly underfoot, the doors opening and closing without reason, and the wind carrying faint, almost human sounds that echoed through the empty halls. Local children who dared peek past the fence told of a figure wandering the woods at night, hunched and silent, with eyes that glimmered faintly in the dark, disappearing when anyone attempted to approach. It was not long before the stories of the disappearance intertwined with the legend of the pact, the whispers suggesting that the colonel's agreements carried a price far greater than obedience. Each new day brought unease, as the remaining slaves noticed subtle changes in the mansion, food left untouched, rooms that seemed colder than before, and a pervasive feeling that someone, or something, was watching. Fear was no longer a private sentiment, it had become a tangible presence, seeping into the walls, curling around the servants' limbs, and tightening like chains that could not be broken. The disappearance marked a turning point, the first visible proof that the colonel's secrets were not merely rumors, that his power was real, and that those bound to the estate by blood, labor, or fate were already caught in the first threads of a darkness that would not easily let go. It was a chance discovery, accidental yet fateful, that shifted the uneasy tension surrounding the mansion into something far more tangible and horrifying. A young servant, tasked with cleaning the oldest wing of the estate, noticed a loose floorboard beneath the grand staircase, worn by decades of footsteps yet strangely out of place. Curiosity, mingled with the reckless boldness of youth, drove him to pry it open, revealing a small cavity. There, hidden from the eyes of everyone, lay a journal bound in dark, cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age and smelling faintly of decay and iron. The handwriting inside was precise, almost meticulous, each stroke deliberate, yet the content was anything but orderly. It chronicled the life of the colonel, but not in the mundane details one might expect of a plantation owner. This was a map of obsession, secrecy, and a pact that intertwined life and death, loyalty and terror. The entry spoke of the arrangement with his wife and the 7 slaves, of promises extracted in whispers and sealed with threats that no one dared test. There were detailed accounts of rituals, odd timings, strange symbols etched into the margins, and cryptic instructions that suggested forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Each page seemed to pulse with intent, as if the journal itself were alive, observing the reader, judging them, demanding understanding. The servant, overwhelmed, tried to show it to another, but the weight of the text seemed to bend the mind, the words a tangled maze that provoked fear, curiosity, and a sense of compulsion all at once. It became clear that the journal was not merely a record, it was a key, a guide to understanding the dark undercurrent that had gripped the estate for generations. Entries detailed disappearances, strange illnesses, and the gradual unraveling of the family line, attributing each misfortune to the delicate balance of the pact and the adherence, or failure, to its obscure rules. There were references to the woods, to midnight gatherings, and to the unseen presence that seemed to linger over the property, watching, waiting, and punishing those who faltered. The servant realized that knowledge itself was dangerous, to possess the journal was to be implicated, to be drawn into the web of the colonel's design, yet the compulsion to read further was irresistible. Each revelation brought new questions, deeper fears, and a creeping understanding that the mansion and its occupants were bound by forces older than memory, forces written down in ink but enforced by something far more tangible. The journal became both a window and a trap, offering insight into the horrors that had unfolded while simultaneously hinting that those who dared to uncover the truth might never escape the mansion's shadow, for some secrets demand loyalty, obedience, and, in the end, a price that could never truly be paid. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper of unease that threaded through the mansion and the surrounding woods, touching everyone who lived under the colonel's roof. At first, it was small things, food that spoiled before its time, animals that refused to be fed, and the unsettling sensation that the air itself had grown heavier, charged with a tension that pressed on the chest. Then came the more disturbing signs, impossible to ignore, things that spoke of a curse woven into the very fabric of the estate. The colonel's family began to suffer strange illnesses that doctors could neither name nor cure, fevers and chills that ebbed and flowed as though some invisible hand controlled the ebb of life itself. Children were born with deformities, subtle at first, but worsening with each passing year, a cruel testament to generations already bound by the dark pact. The servants whispered that every misfortune was no accident, that the estate itself had become a vessel for the consequences of deals made in shadows, where obedience was rewarded with survival, but failure brought suffering beyond imagination. At night, the mansion seemed alive, creaking and groaning in ways that mocked its occupants, doors opening to empty halls, windows rattling though the wind was still, shadows stretching longer than reason allowed, hinting at the presence of something unseen. The colonel himself appeared unaffected at first, moving with the same quiet precision and commanding presence, but even he could not fully shield himself from the creeping effects of what the townsfolk had begun to call the curse. Faces that were once handsome or fair became gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and worry, and whispers of madness began to thread through the family line, as if the blood carried the weight of the pact in every pulse. The slaves, too, were not spared. They complained of voices in the night that spoke their sins aloud, of shadows that watched without ever blinking, and of cold hands brushing against their skin when no one was near. Superstitions that had long been dismissed took on new significance. Charms, prayers, and rituals attempted to ward off the invisible hand, but nothing could halt the slow, relentless spread of the curse. Even the townsfolk, those who lived miles away, reported feelings of unease when passing the estate, a creeping sense that misfortune clung to the land itself, and that anyone who entered risked being drawn into the legacy of terror, obsession, and destruction that the colonel had set in motion. For the curse did not discriminate, it fed on fear, secrecy, and blood, growing stronger with each act of obedience, each unspoken transgression, and each heartbeat that pulsed under the shadow of the mansion. The nights at the estate became longer and more suffocating as the colonel's rituals began to assert their presence, casting a shadow that no one could ignore. From the edges of the woods, neighbors sometimes glimpsed flickering lights through the trees, pale orange glows that pulsed in rhythm with chants carried faintly by the wind. The rituals themselves were shrouded in secrecy, performed in the dead of night, and only those closest to the colonel had a chance of witnessing them, though many claimed that witnessing was not a privilege but a curse. Candles were arranged in precise patterns, symbols carved into the earth or walls, and strange objects, some organic, some metallic, were placed with meticulous care as though each component were essential to controlling forces beyond understanding. The slaves were often forced to participate, their obedience demanded under threat, their compliance extracting a toll on their bodies and spirits. They spoke in whispers of moments when the air thickened, vibrating with an almost tangible energy, of shadows that moved independently of the flames, twisting unnaturally to reach toward those who stood too close or faltered in devotion. The colonel's wife, already a hollow figure of torment, was drawn deeper into these ceremonies, her role both central and horrifying, a living instrument of the Pact's power, her presence amplifying the darkness that surrounded them. The young servant who had discovered the hidden journal tried to understand the rituals, piecing together fragments of Latin, diagrams, and cryptic instructions, but every attempt to decipher the purpose only heightened his fear. The more he knew, the more he felt the estate's malevolence pressing down, a suffocating force that seemed to punish knowledge itself. On certain nights, those who had peered too closely reported hearing low chants that sounded both human and something otherworldly, echoing across the trees and carrying through the fog like a dirge meant for the living and the dead alike. Animals reacted violently during these times, barking, screeching, or fleeing the estate entirely, and the mansion itself seemed to breathe with an ominous rhythm, doors opening and closing without wind, shadows pooling into corners where no one had been. Each ritual appeared designed to strengthen the colonel's control over the estate and its inhabitants, bending the living to his will while feeding the unseen forces that demanded obedience, sacrifice, and silence. The atmosphere grew oppressive, so heavy that even the bravest townsfolk hesitated to approach, as though the very ground bore witness to transgressions no one dared name, and the presence of the rituals became an unshakable reminder that the Pact was not merely a legend or superstition, but a living, breathing force that could twist minds, claim bodies, and consume souls in ways that no one had yet begun to fully comprehend. The sense of dread that had settled over the estate thickened when the first act of betrayal began to ripple through the carefully maintained order of the colonel's domain. Among the slaves, one had grown quiet and watchful in a way that marked him as different, a figure whose mind churned with a desperate, dangerous awareness. He had observed the rituals, noted the patterns of the colonel's movements, and discovered truths that none of the others dared acknowledge. Each whispered warning, each furtive glance at the hidden journal, fueled a determination to escape the suffocating weight of the Pact, to break free from the invisible chains that bound him and the others to the colonel's will. His plan was cautious, slow, designed to avoid detection, but even the most careful moves were not without risk, for the estate had eyes and ears that seemed to extend beyond ordinary comprehension, and the shadows themselves appeared to respond to any hint of defiance. One night, under the cover of dense fog and silence, he attempted to flee, moving past the sleeping mansion and into the dark, tangled woods, his heartbeat a frantic drum in the oppressive night. But the colonel was never far from awareness. Something had shifted in the air, a subtle pressure that indicated the violation had been felt before it occurred, a premonition that stretched across the trees and whispered into the mind of the would-be escapee. The betrayal did not go unnoticed, and the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Other slaves reported seeing figures, some human, some impossibly distorted, moving through the forest, searching for the one who had dared defy the unspoken rules. The night carried screams, muffled and terrifying, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees and rattling the nerves of those too afraid to intervene. The mansion itself seemed to convulse with the disruption, doors slamming against their frames, walls groaning, and candles flickering wildly, as though the house were reacting to the disturbance like a living organism. Within hours, the attempted escape shattered the fragile equilibrium that had kept fear manageable, showing that the Pact was no longer a theoretical force but a living, responsive entity that demanded loyalty and exacted punishment without hesitation. The betrayal revealed that the Colonel's dominion extended far beyond human comprehension, that the very estate, the woods, and the shadows conspired to maintain control, and that any act of defiance, no matter how small or secret, would unleash consequences that could ripple through every life tethered to the mansion, deepening the sense of terror and cementing the understanding that no one within its reach could ever truly be free. The effects of the Pact and the Colonel's relentless rituals began to manifest most cruelly within his own bloodline, a slow unraveling that no medicine, prayer, or charm could halt. It started subtly, with small changes that could have been dismissed as coincidence: an erratic glance, a tremor in the hand, a child born with eyes too large for their face, but the signs multiplied, forming a pattern impossible to ignore. Each generation seemed to inherit more than just the estate; they inherited the consequences of the Pact, as if the weight of promises made in shadows had been etched directly into their DNA. Parents watched helplessly as children grew with twisted forms and minds that seemed tethered to a reality warped by fear and secrecy. Madness crept in quietly, beginning with murmured voices behind closed doors, moving objects that no one touched, and unprovoked episodes of rage or despair. Those who attempted to intervene found themselves powerless, as if the estate itself resisted outside influence, shaping the family according to rules written long before their birth. The slaves, now seasoned observers of the unfolding horror, spoke in hushed tones about the changes, noting how the Colonel's children resembled their parents but carried a hardness in their eyes, a coldness that suggested not innocence but complicity in the darkness that surrounded them. Nights became a theater of suffering. The family would wander hallways in a trance-like state, speaking to shadows, performing tasks dictated by invisible forces, or remaining rigidly silent for hours, as though the house demanded obedience and punished curiosity. Even the Colonel was not immune. His own body and mind reflected the heavy toll of generations bound by fear, obsession, and dark promises. Families outside the estate whispered that the bloodline was cursed, that anyone daring to marry into it would be tainted, and that the mansion's influence extended like tendrils into neighboring lands, carrying misfortune and decay wherever the descendants went. The once proud lineage, known for wealth and social standing, deteriorated into secrecy and isolation, each member more haunted than the last, trapped by the weight of a pact they had never signed yet could not escape. The estate itself seemed to grow darker with each generation, rooms sagging under unseen pressures, trees curling toward the house as if to protect its secrets, and shadows pooling thickly in corners where no one ventured. The descent was inexorable, attempts at normality were fleeting, always interrupted by a sudden crisis, a strange illness, or a violent outburst that reminded everyone that the Pact's reach was absolute. Over time, it became clear that the family's story was no longer one of ambition or inheritance, but of inevitability, a grim testament to the idea that some bargains are too powerful to resist, some legacies too dark to survive, and some bloodlines are doomed to fall into ruin under the weight of promises made long before the first cries of their children. Final reckoning came like a storm that had been brewing for generations, slow at first, almost imperceptible, and then sudden, violent, and all-consuming. The estate, long a silent witness to whispers, disappearances, and the slow corruption of the Colonel's family, seemed to awaken fully, as if the darkness that had lingered in corners and shadows finally decided to make itself known. The last remaining members of the family, already twisted by the weight of the Pact and the curse that had shadowed them, began to crumble under its immense pressure. Their minds fractured, memories tangled with fear and hallucinations, and every instinct that had once been human was replaced with the compulsions dictated by the unseen forces that governed the estate. The slaves, some long broken, some secretly defiant, watched in terror and awe as the mansion's walls seemed to pulse with life, the floors groaning beneath a weight that was not entirely physical, and the air crackling with energy that bent the senses. In the woods, unearthly figures appeared, silhouetted by pale moonlight, moving with unnatural grace, and the faintest whisper of the Pact's words carried through the trees like an invisible chain, binding all who dwelled near. The Colonel himself, once so imposing, could barely stand against the culmination of the very deal he had orchestrated. His authority fractured, the rituals he had once commanded now consuming him instead of bending to his will. The hidden journal, long a source of forbidden knowledge, seemed almost sentient, revealing secrets too horrifying to comprehend yet impossible to ignore, each page a key to understanding the full scope of the doom he had wrought. As the night deepened, the estate became a theater of reckoning, rooms collapsing, fires igniting without cause, shadows twisting into forms that mimicked the faces of those who had been lost over the years. The wife, a central figure in the Pact's original binding, appeared at the threshold of the great hall, her figure ethereal, her voice carrying both accusation and despair, a reminder of the price that had been paid and the innocence that had been consumed. The remaining family members, the slaves, and the estate itself seemed to converge in a moment of ultimate judgment, where every secret, every betrayal, every act of obedience and defiance was laid bare, and the true horror of the pact revealed. By dawn, the mansion stood quiet again, but it was a silence heavy with the weight of a legacy destroyed, of lives consumed, and of a dynasty that had been meticulously built only to collapse under the very darkness it had attempted to control, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of promises made in shadows, the memory of fear, and the lingering, unshakable certainty that some bargains are too potent to ever truly end.